Detective Morgan Daniels sat in his car, staring at the flashing lights on his dashboard. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the kind that made the sound of the radio hum in his ears as he waited for anything to happen. The call had come in just 20 minutes earlier, a routine wellness check. Emma Caldwell. Nothing specific, just a neighbor's vague concern. Something about her becoming reclusive in recent weeks. As he turned onto the tree-lined street of the suburban neighborhood, an unsettling feeling settled in his chest. The air was thick, though the sky was clear. It was a sharp contrast to the sense of dread hanging over him, like a storm brewing unseen. He parked in front of the house. It was neat, almost too neat, no sign of life. The mailbox was full, the curtains drawn tight. The place seemed abandoned. "Doesn't feel right," he muttered to himself. Daniel stepped out of the car, his boots crunching the gravel driveway beneath him. The house was locked up tight, all the windows closed. There were no signs of forced entry, no indication of struggle, but the silence screamed. A faint smell lingered in the air. Cleaner. Bleach. It didn't fit the neighborhood. As Daniels approached the front door, he hesitated. This wasn't the first time he'd walked into a home where something was wrong, but wasn't sure what. It was unsettling, like the house was holding its breath. He knocked. No answer. "Emma Caldwell, is anyone home?" Daniels called out. The silence was broken only by the faint chirping of a distant bird. He tried the door. It was locked. His instincts kicked in. He went around to the back, hoping for an open window, but found nothing. Only more of the same emptiness. No sounds, no movement. The neighbors had nothing helpful to offer. A man down the street mentioned he hadn't seen her in days, but nothing more. A woman who lived next door murmured something about Emma's isolation, but no one could explain why she'd suddenly vanished. There was a quiet concern in their voices, but no answers. "This doesn't make sense," Daniels whispered. Something was off. After a thorough search of the house, Daniels made his way to the garage. It was detached from the house, cold and uninviting, with the door slightly ajar. His senses heightened. The garage smelled faintly of dust and oil, but there was something else, something more sinister in the air. Daniels's gaze shifted to the far corner of the garage, where an old freezer stood, its surface coated in a layer of grime. The freezer was locked, unusual for a home where every other appliance was open and accessible. He stood still for a moment, the hairs on his neck rising. He walked closer, every step amplified by the eerie silence of the place. The freezer beckoned him. "Lead nowhere, lock a freezer," he muttered, kneeling in front of it. Daniels didn't hesitate. He reached for his tools and quickly cracked open the lock. It was a swift motion, one born of instinct more than reason. As the latch clicked open, the lid creaked, revealing a sight that would haunt him forever. Inside the freezer were human remains, dismembered pieces of a body, carefully arranged and sealed in plastic bags. There was no mistaking it. The parts were methodically packed, frozen like they were meant to be preserved. The grotesque nature of the discovery stopped Daniels in his tracks, and his transformed apparition passed Daniels in his tracks. His stomach churned, his mind racing. He stumbled backward, breathless. What the hell? The realization hit him like a freight train. The victim was here, but who? Why? And how had Emma Caldwell been involved in this? His hands shook as he pulled out his phone, dialing for backup. But inside, he knew. This case was no longer a simple wellness check. This was murder. As the first responders arrived, Daniels stood by, his mind working in overdrive. He'd seen a lot in his career, but this was different. The case was tangled, wrapped in layers of lies and secrets that seemed to stretch beyond what he could understand. The house itself seemed to whisper secrets. The cold air that had settled into the room, the meticulous way everything had been cleaned, the weird lack of personal items. It all pointed to something deeper. Daniels's thoughts drifted back to Emma. Her reclusiveness, her isolation, the strange way people spoke of her. He could feel it, the tension that had built up in this house. A realization struck him. Emma hadn't just been hiding from the world. She had been hiding something much darker. And now, that something was staring him in the face. "Dumb look," he said as he headed downstairs. "Last summer," he said, and he turned to the lead investigator, his eyes hardening. "We need to find her, and when we do, we need answers." The discovery of the body in the freezer set the stage for the unraveling of a dark and twisted tale. Detective Daniels knew that Emma Caldwell was at the center of it all. But what he didn't know yet was just how deeply entwined she was in this macabre web of lies, manipulation, and betrayal. As the investigation unfolded, more secrets would emerge, leading Daniels down a path that would leave him questioning the very nature of justice. Emma Caldwell lived alone in a house tucked away in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where everything appeared perfect on the outside, but whispered of hidden stories within. She was in her mid-40s, her hair a little too neat, her movements a little too controlled. There were no signs of chaos in her life, just a calculated calmness that hid a deep loneliness. Emma, her habits were meticulous, dusting the same spots, arranging the same books on the shelf, and cooking dinner for one, day after day. She would spend hours in her garden, planting flowers she'd never see bloom. When the neighbors passed by, they waved, and Emma would offer a polite smile, though it never quite reached her eyes. Her emotional walls were thick, built from years of hurt, especially the fallout from her divorce. Emma's ex-husband had left her without explanation, leaving her to shoulder the burden of raising their son alone. "A day at a time," she whispered to herself, trying to convince her reflection that the isolation was her choice. But deep down, the void in her heart was only growing wider. Neighbors remembered Emma as the woman who once had a bright future, but that future dimmed after her divorce. Her son had left for college years ago, and their contact had become sparse. The emotional wounds from her failed marriage still lingered, festering beneath the surface. "I think Emma's just given up," Mrs. Wilkins, a neighbor, murmured. "Her boy never visits, and she's become so withdrawn. I can't say I blame her. It's like she's frozen in time." Her son Daniel barely spoke to her now. His calls were infrequent, the conversations short, and the connection they once shared had all but disappeared. Emma's home, once filled with laughter, was now silent, and her heart echoed with the same emptiness. It was a Tuesday when Paul Timmons walked into Emma's life, like a breath of fresh air after years of suffocating loneliness. He was charming, confident, and easy to talk to. He spoke with a calm assurance that drew Emma in. He shared stories of a troubled past, of mistakes and lessons learned, of a man trying to rebuild after losing everything. He promised her peace, stability, a fresh start. "I know what it's like to feel lost," he said one evening, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "I'm just trying to make sense of the pieces. Maybe you and I could figure it out together?" Emma found herself captivated by his words, his touch, and the tenderness in his voice. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope for something more. In Paul, she saw the companion she had longed for, a man who could fill the void left by her failed marriage, someone who could take away the loneliness that had haunted her for so long. Over time, Paul's charming facade began to show cracks. His once tender affection turned into something darker. His touch was no longer comforting, but controlling, a soft pressure that slowly bled into her life. He began to make subtle demands, small changes at first, like the way Emma kept the house, what she wore, how much time she spent with friends. His words, once comforting, now held a weight that made Emma feel guilty for wanting anything for herself. One evening, Emma found a note in her purse, hastily scribbled, "You don't need anyone but me." She stared at it, confused. There was no return address, no signature. Just the cold message. "So," Brett, sliding the folder in his trunk. Mary laid down her book and started fingering the texture. Brett held the folder straight out, so the bright red foliage would blend the background into the dark. When she confronted Paul, he seemed genuine. "It's nothing. Just a little reminder. I don't want you getting distracted. You and me, us. That's all that matters now." But Emma couldn't shake the feeling of unease. His absences grew more frequent, his moods more erratic. She found herself walking on eggshells, unsure of what might set him off. "I don't want to feel like this," Emma whispered one night as she looked at her reflection. The woman staring back at her was someone she didn't recognize anymore. Despite her growing suspicions, Emma became more entangled in her relationship with Paul. His presence in her life felt like a slow-burning fire. At first, she welcomed the warmth. But over time, the fire became too close, too hot. She felt smothered by his demands, yet could not imagine a life without him. "I'm here for you, Emma," Paul would say, each word dripping with both promise and control. "You don't need anyone else. I can take care of everything." Startled, Paul asked, "Did I hear right that you rejected the help of Christian writer and artist?" Emma shrugged. Her world, once her own, was now centered around him. Her finances, her decisions, even her thoughts. Paul had slowly wormed his way into every aspect of her life, and she found herself relying on him more and more. Friends who had once been a comfort to her noticed the change. He missed between them. "Emma, you don't look the same," one friend said, her voice laced with concern. "You're not you." But Emma, caught in the web Paul had spun, just smiled and nodded. She didn't have the energy to explain. She didn't want to explain. The truth was, she had no idea who she was anymore. Detective Morgan Daniels had seen his fair share of broken lives, but Emma Caldwell's case was different. His career had been marked by the kind of cold, rational investigation that kept the emotions at bay. But there was something about Emma's story that gnawed at him, something strong and crushing. And somewhere along the way, it spilled, something raw in the way she'd withdrawn, the way people had talked about her, like there was more to the story than met the eye. Opening her lips to reveal her teeth was a story. Daniels, however, was no stranger to tragedy. His past, marred by his own unresolved losses, made him more empathetic to victims like Emma. He felt the weight of her story, even before he knew the details. He had seen too many cases where emotional manipulation led to destructive consequences. As he reviewed the case files, he couldn't shake the feeling that Emma was a woman on the edge, someone teetering between salvation and something far darker. Daniels was determined to find the truth. Emma had always been a picture of composure at work, but lately she couldn't keep up the act. Her colleagues had started noticing small changes that painted a different picture. She was rarely in the office anymore, and when she was, it was only for short stretches of time, her excuses growing more and more convoluted. "Emma, you all right?" asked Karen, a co-worker who had been Emma's friend for years. You've been out sick a lot lately. Is everything okay?" Emma smiled weakly, but there was nothing in her eyes to match it. "Oh, just a little tired." The tiredness was more than just physical. It was in the way she held herself, stiff, her arms often hidden beneath layers of clothing, even on warmer days. Karen had noticed the bruises, the odd markings on her arms that looked like someone had gripped too hard. But Emma quickly covered them with a shift of her sleeve, a shift that went unnoticed by most but lingered in Karen's mind. "Everything's fine, Karen. Really," Emma added, but Karen wasn't convinced. She'd known Emma long enough to see that something was wrong, even if Emma wouldn't admit it. Emma's life had shifted in subtle ways since Paul entered it. It started small. Paul would offer to run errands for her, to take care of the details she didn't have the energy for. Emma, so accustomed to doing everything herself, was grateful. But soon, the kindness turned to control. "Where are you going?" Paul asked one night, as Emma grabbed her purse, ready to leave for an impromptu dinner with a friend. His tone was casual, but the question was more like a command. "I'll come with you." Emma hesitated. "I'm just meeting Karen for dinner. It'll only be a quick thing." "I don't think that's a good idea," Paul insisted, his voice softer but still firm. "I want to be with you. You're better off with me." She frowned. "Paul, you don't have to come every time. I'm just meeting a friend." His smile was warm, but his eyes darkened. "I don't want you to get hurt. You don't need anyone else but me. You know that, right?" Emma felt the pressure, subtle at first, but now impossible to ignore. Paul's hold on her tightened, his presence shadowing her every decision. He started taking control of her finances, using her credit card without asking. He'd moved in, taking over the space she had once kept to herself, subtly pushing away the life she had known before. It didn't take long before Paul's affection took a darker turn. The notes started showing up around the house, scraps of paper with short, cryptic messages that made Emma's skin crawl. "I'm watching you," one note read, left on the kitchen counter in the morning. Another, slipped under the door one night, simply said, "I know what you've done." Not even a single question, not even a... Emma's heart pounded as she read the words, unsure if Paul had written them or if someone else was watching her. But his presence in the house grew more oppressive as the days went by. The calm, collected man she had fallen for had transformed into something else entirely. A man who seemed to know every step she took, even when she wasn't around. "I'm sorry I'm late," Emma said one evening, trying to explain herself. "I just got caught up in some work." Paul, sitting at the kitchen table, stared at her with cold eyes. "Don't lie to me, Emma. You're always hiding something. I can feel it. And I won't let you go." Kate sat on the bed and squinted at the screen, hoping to find something that would show her a way out. She saw, during the investigation, Emma's journal was found hidden in a drawer, the pages yellowed and frayed from use. It was a window into her troubled mind, filled with rambling thoughts and dark confessions. The journal, once a space for her to work through her emotions, had become a record of her growing terror. "Sometimes I hear noises at night," one entry read. "I don't know if it's Paul or if I'm just imagining things. He says I'm crazy, but I feel like I'm losing my grip. I think he's hiding something from me. I'm not safe here anymore, but I can't leave." Each entry became darker than the last, filled with desperation and fear. Emma's paranoia was evident, her mind racing with thoughts of what Paul might do to her if she tried to break free. "I don't know how much longer I can keep up this charade," she wrote. "I'm trapped, and I don't think I'll ever get out." Emma's isolation deepened, and she found herself increasingly dependent on Paul. She confided in Karen, though the words didn't come easily. They did not leave that night. "I don't know what's happening to me," Emma confessed, her voice trembling. "I feel trapped. Every time I try to leave, he pulls me back in. It's like he knows everything about me, everything I've done. I don't think I can escape." Karen's eyes widened in concern. "What do you mean, knows everything?" Emma's voice dropped to a whisper. "Paul knows too much. He knows things from my past. Things I've tried to forget. If I leave, he'll ruin me." "Sí and Soleil's," he said repeatedly. The weight of her words hung heavy between them. Karen's heart sank as she realized how far Emma had fallen, how deep Paul's grip had become. But Emma wasn't ready to hear the truth. She was too far gone, too tangled in Paul's web of lies and manipulation. One night, as Emma sat in the dimly lit living room, a heated argument between her and Paul erupted. The walls of the house shook with the sound of raised voices, the fury in Paul's tone unmistakable. "Why do you keep lying to me, Emma?" Paul shouted, his fists pounding the table. "I know what you're doing behind my back." Emma, trembling, tried to reason with him. "I'm not lying, Paul. I'm just tired. Tired of being scared all the time. You're suffocating me." The shouting grew louder until it was heard outside, where neighbors stood at their windows, uneasy. And then, abruptly, the yelling stopped. The house fell silent, except for a moment it seemed like the calm after a storm. But the silence was more ominous than any shouting could have been. The neighbors exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that something catastrophic had just taken place within the walls of Emma's home. The tension in Emma's house had become unbearable. Every day Paul grew bolder, his demands more insistent, his threats more pointed. It had started with small requests, help with finances, decisions about the house. But now, it had reached a breaking point. "I want it all, Emma," Paul said one night, his voice dark and forceful. "I want your savings, your accounts, everything. If you don't give me what I'm owed, I'll expose everything about you. Everything. You think I don't know the things you've tried so hard to bury?" Emma froze. The words hit her like a punch to the gut, her mind racing as Paul stood before her, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity she had never seen before. Her heart pounded in her chest. She knew what he was talking about. Secrets from her past. The ones she'd buried so deep she thought they were safe. She looked at him, trembling. "Please, don't." "You have no choice," Paul cut her off. "Sign it over to me, or the world will know what you've done. You won't have anyone left, Emma. Not even yourself." Emma's throat went dry. She knew what he was capable of. She'd seen it in his eyes before, how he could twist her emotions, manipulate her until she gave in. But this was different. This was her life on the line. She had a choice to make: comply and lose everything, or fight back and risk everything she had left. Days passed, but the weight of Paul's ultimatum hung over Emma like a dark cloud. The tension was suffocating. Every conversation with Paul seemed to spiral into confrontation, every moment spent in his presence a reminder of her entrapment. She was suffocating in a relationship that had started with promises of safety and stability, but had turned into something toxic. "I don't want to do this anymore," Emma whispered one night, sitting on the edge of their bed, her hands shaking. "I'm not happy. I can't keep living like this." Paul's expression darkened. "You'll never leave me," he spat, stepping closer. "I'm the only one who can fix you, Emma. You can't escape me. You won't survive without me." His words hit Emma like a slap to the face. He was right. She felt cornered, trapped in her own life. The emotional and physical strain had taken its toll. She could feel the walls closing in around her, and there was no way out. Like him, She considered herself a lone flyer regarding her path. Her heart raced as the argument escalated. She was shaking with fear, but she couldn't back down. Not anymore. The fight was unlike any they'd had before. It started with a harsh word, then a shove, then a slap. Emma's breath came in sharp gasps as Paul pressed her against the wall, his hands on her throat, the weight of his anger suffocating her. The man she had once loved now stood before her as a stranger. Someone capable of violence, someone who would destroy her if she didn't fight back. "Please, Paul," she gasped, her voice trembling. "Stop, I can't breathe." But the anger in his eyes was all-consuming. "You've lied to me, Emma. You've always lied to me. You think I'll let you go?" In that moment, something inside Emma snapped. The fight-or-flight instinct kicked in, and she pushed him away with all the strength she had left. Her hands reached for anything nearby, and she grabbed a heavy object, a vase from the dresser. She swung it at him, the force of her fear propelling her. Now she forced haste. She landed barefoot in the dry dust, a vase from the dresser. Paul fell back, a cry of pain escaping his lips, but Emma didn't stop. The terror, the years of manipulation, of constant fear, surged within her. She swung again, and this time it was enough. Paul collapsed, his body still. Emma stood there, gasping for breath, her mind spinning in a haze of panic. She had never meant for this to happen. She hadn't meant to kill him. But it was too late. The reality of what had happened hit Emma all at once. She stood over Paul's body, her breath ragged, her hands covered in blood. The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. This wasn't the life she'd wanted, the life she had dreamed of when Paul first came into her world. But now, it was her nightmare. She couldn't call the police. She couldn't let anyone know what she'd done. She was too far gone. With trembling hands, Emma dragged Paul's body into the kitchen. Her mind was a blur of frantic thoughts. She had to hide him. She had to make everything disappear. Her movements were robotic, a desperate attempt to maintain some semblance of control. She dismembered Paul's body, her heart hammering in her chest as she worked. Every cut, every slice was a step deeper into a world of lies and deception. She cleaned up every trace of blood, every speck of evidence. There was no turning back now. When she finished, Emma carefully placed the pieces of Paul's body into the freezer. The cold, lifeless container was the only thing that seemed to give her some measure of comfort. She shut the door, sealing away the evidence of her actions. As the freezer door slammed behind her, she turned to Antioch. As the door clicked shut, Emma felt the weight of her decision sink in. She had made a choice, a decision that would change her life forever. The freezer held the secret now, her secret. But the truth wasn't gone. It would never be gone. Emma knew that sooner or later, someone would find out. But for now, she could hold on to the fragile illusion that she had control over her life again. And from that time on, Detective Morgan Daniels had been investigating Emma's case for weeks now, and something about her story didn't sit right with him. The inconsistencies, the strange behaviors, the vague explanations. He was beginning to piece together a disturbing picture. The breakthrough came when he discovered Emma's journal. As he read her words, he saw the paranoia, the fear, the lies. And with each page, Daniels's suspicion grew. The timeline didn't add up. Emma's alibis were shaky. The more he dug, the more he realized that the quiet woman he had initially thought of as a victim had something far darker hidden beneath the surface. His investigation led him to the freezer. When he opened it, the stench of death hit him like a wall. Inside were the dismembered remains of Paul Timmons, hidden away in a desperate attempt to protect a life built on lies. Abe Sharon. Timmons started up his fabled exploratory system. It found Timmons' subconscious, Daniel stood there, a chill creeping down his spine as he realized the truth. Emma Caldwell wasn't just a victim. She was a woman who had been pushed to the edge, and in her desperation, she had become something else entirely. Weeks had passed since the discovery of Paul's body, and Detective Morgan Daniels could feel the weight of the case pressing on him. His investigation had peeled back layer after layer of deception, leaving him with a sense of grim inevitability. Emma Caldwell was running out of places to hide. Daniel stood outside a small run-down house, his breath coming out in foggy bursts. The air was cold, but it wasn't the chill of winter that made his skin prickle. It was the fact that they had finally tracked her down. Emma was hiding in a relative's house, broken and unraveling. When Daniel stepped inside, the sight of her sent a shiver down his spine. Her hair was unkempt, her face pale, eyes hollow. She looked like someone who had been through hell, and she had. But there was more than hell in those eyes. It was as if Teresa shared. "Emma Caldwell," Daniel said quietly, his voice steady. "You're under arrest for the murder of Paul Timmons." Emma didn't fight it. She barely looked up. Her eyes filled with tears, her body sagging with the weight of everything she had done. "I didn't know what else to do," she whispered, barely audible. "He wouldn't leave me alone." Her confession was soft, filled with regret and fear. But there was something else, an admission that this moment, this inevitable arrest, had come after so much suffering. Daniels handcuffed her gently, the finality of the moment weighing heavily on both of them. The trial had captured the public's attention, and Emma Caldwell was no longer just the quiet woman from the suburbs. She was a symbol, a reflection of something much darker within the system. The courtroom was packed every day, with reporters swarming the aisles, their cameras snapping constantly. Emma's defense team painted a portrait of a woman who had been emotionally abused and manipulated for years. They argued that Paul Timmons had controlled her, used her, and that his threats had pushed her to the edge. She had no choice, her lawyer argued, his voice full of passion. She was pushed to the brink. She was a victim of years of manipulation and psychological abuse. But the prosecution countered with cold facts. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment crime, they argued. Emma Caldwell took the time to dismember Paul's body. She meticulously cleaned the crime scene, concealing the evidence in the freezer. The words echoed through the courtroom, painting a different picture, one of premeditation and intent. As the days went on, the tension in the courtroom grew. Emma sat motionless in her chair, her eyes empty, as the fight over her fate waged on. Every word, every argument, felt like a stab, twisting deeper into the raw wound of her guilt and shame. Next, the jury deliberated for hours. When the verdict finally came, it was like the room held its breath. "Guilty," the foreman said, his voice firm. Emma's world tilted. The shock was immediate, but it was the weight of the truth that hit her hardest. She had been convicted of manslaughter, a lesser charge than murder, but the consequences were no less devastating. The judge spoke the words that Emma had feared, but also expected. "You are sentenced to 15 years in prison." She barely registered the sentence. The shock left her numb, her body frozen in place. It was as if she had become a ghost, trapped in a body she no longer recognized. The weight of her guilt, her actions, her desperation, they all crashed down on her in that moment. Her supporters, her few remaining friends, stared in disbelief. They had hoped for something different. But deep down, they knew this was the only possible outcome. Emma had taken a life, and no amount of manipulation, no amount of pain, could erase that truth. Daniel sat alone in his office, the weight of the case settling in his chest like a stone. His empathy for Emma had clouded his judgment at times, and now, with the trial behind him, he was left to grapple with the aftermath. He looked around his office, feeling the weight of judgment and embarrassment by way of the gravity. He had always believed in justice. But was this really justice? Emma's actions had been violent, premeditated even, but the years of emotional abuse she'd endured couldn't be ignored. Daniels wondered if the system had truly understood the depths of her suffering, or had it simply punished her for what she had done, without considering why she'd done it. "I don't know anymore," he muttered to himself, running a hand over his face. His personal trauma, the pain of his own past, made him see Emma in a way others couldn't. She wasn't just a criminal. She was a woman who had been cornered, broken by forces beyond her control. As Daniels closed the case file, he couldn't help but wonder how many others had been pushed too far, silenced by fear, by guilt, by the weight of their own actions. The months after the trial were filled with reflection for Detective Daniels. He couldn't shake the thought that Emma's case was just one of many hidden in the shadows. She wasn't the only one who had suffered at the hands of manipulation. She wasn't the only one who had been driven to act out of desperation. Daniels stared out of his office window one afternoon, the world outside bustling with life, while he felt trapped in his own thoughts. What had Emma's case really been about? Justice? Or something deeper? Something systemic that no one wanted to acknowledge? How many victims were out there, too afraid to speak, too afraid to ask for help until it was too late? The case, for all its resolution, left Daniels with a deep moral burden. He had done his job, but was the system really doing its part? Or was it just another way of punishing those who had already been broken by a world that didn't care? As the days passed, Daniels couldn't escape the feeling that in some ways Emma's story was just beginning. And in a way, it was his too. The truth about Emma's relationship with Paul was one that few had seen, and even fewer understood. She had been isolated for so long, her sense of self slowly eaten away by the man she had once trusted. What began as affection turned into control, and that control turned into fear. For Emma, Paul's manipulation was like a tightening noose, one small tug at a time. At first, it was subtle, an offhand comment here or there about how she dressed, who she spoke to, or how much time she spent alone. Then it grew, his grip tightening with each passing day. Emma's isolation became her prison, and every moment spent away from Paul felt like an eternity of torment. Her colleagues noticed the change. They'd seen the vibrant woman she used to be, the one who spoke about her dreams and laughed freely. But now, Emma had become a shadow of herself. She would look over her shoulder when someone asked her a question, her eyes darting to the door, afraid of what Paul might do if she were caught talking too much. Paul's emotional manipulation left Emma believing she couldn't live without him. Every time she thought of leaving, the fear would rise in her chest. "You won't survive without me," he'd said. "You'll be nothing. No one will love you like I do." His words became her reality. It wasn't just the isolation. Emma's sense of self-worth had been chipped away over time. Each day she spent in his world, she became smaller, weaker, more dependent on the very man who was suffocating her. This wasn't love. It was a slow, agonizing death of her spirit. No one had seen it, not really. Her friends didn't know what was happening in her home behind closed doors. Her family, too far removed to notice the subtle shift in her behavior. They thought Emma was just going through a phase, or that she'd become distant because of her divorce. But the truth was much darker. Emma's situation wasn't just the result of her being overwhelmed by life. It was years of emotional abuse that no one had identified. Her colleagues had noticed the bruises on her arms, but no one connected the dots. They had asked, but Emma had brushed them off. "I tripped," she'd said, a weak smile on her face, as though she were trying to convince herself more than anyone else. The legal system, too, had failed Emma. The police had responded to calls, but the real issues, what was happening behind closed doors, were never investigated. The cracks in Emma's life had widened under the weight of Paul's manipulation, but no one had seen them for what they were. The tragedy of it all was that, in a world that was supposed to protect victims, Emma had slipped through the cracks. As Daniels sat in his office, the case file open in front of him, his mind raced. He had seen countless cases of violence and betrayal in his years as a detective, but Emma's was different. His empathy for her struggles had blurred the lines between right and wrong. He understood her fear, her desperation, and yet he couldn't reconcile that with the cold facts of what had happened. Emma had killed Paul. There was no denying that. But was it self-defense, as her lawyers had claimed? Or was it something darker, born from years of emotional fracture and manipulation? Daniels couldn't help but feel conflicted. Was she just a victim? Or had she become something else? Someone capable of violence as a way to escape the life she had been trapped in. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The case had taken more from him than he had anticipated. It wasn't just the crime that haunted him, it was the question of justice. Was it really fair to place all the blame on Emma? Or had the system failed her in ways that no one cared to address? Daniels stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the bustling city below. The case was over, but the weight of it still pressed on him. Emma's story wasn't just her own. It was the story of countless others, living in the shadows, suffering in silence, too afraid to speak up. How many more victims were there, trapped in relationships like Emma's? How many more people were suffering from the kind of manipulation that had broken her? Daniels wondered how many of them would ever get a chance to break free, to tell their stories. He turned away from the window, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the world often failed those who needed help the most. He thought of Emma and the countless others who would never get the chance to find justice because no one was paying attention. "There's too much silence," Daniels muttered to himself. "Too many voices lost in the dark." The case was closed, but the truth was clear. Emma's story wasn't the end. It was just one chapter in a much larger, untold tale of hidden abuse. And Daniels knew that as long as people continued to turn a blind eye to the victims of emotional and psychological manipulation, more stories like Emma's would remain buried, unseen by the world.